All right. Just before we get started here, a couple housekeeping things. We will be recording this Zoom session, so we post them after so that people who weren't able to see it can view it. But by participating, that means that you're consenting to being recorded. But before we share anything, all your names from the chat box will be removed, and it'll just be kind of a stream of questions and answers. So it'll be more of an anonymous transcript. All right, let's get started.
All right, so to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the mindset and the framework that Staci and I come to approach kind of a lot of the work that we do in the ways of supporting folks with autism. And that really comes from kind of looking forward to what the outcomes of what we want to happen are, right? And so Staci and I are kind of both focused on this idea of transition. And so we want to put supports in place, and we want to provide experiences and really provide success all along a student and an individual's trajectory through their life to really point to that last area. We want future success down the road. So we want to think about, what are the academic supports to make sure students are going to be successful academically and get the skills and get the experiences that they need to have in those inclusive education environments. But then also, how can we support that social emotional piece? How can we make sure that that students really are connected and belong within the community and the fabric of their school and then their community itself? So as we think about and we talk about these things, this is kind of the mindset that Staci and I kind of approach this with, is thinking about this as sort of three pieces that really we're building towards that final piece. We really want that future independence and success to set our folks up to be able to self-manage and to do to perform a lot of these strategies on their own, because that's really the eventual goal, right, Staci?
Absolutely. Everyone wants their son and daughter and students to be independent and happy and successful. So that's the same that we strive for as well. All right.
And the other piece that I think, Staci and I both come at it with is really thinking about it as from this idea of neurodiversity. And if you've heard Staci and I talk for very long about autism, you've probably heard us talk about neurodiversity. And that really gets into thinking about, the autism spectrum and disability in general, not in terms of a deficit, but really in terms of, a difference in the way that folks think and process information. So as we think about some of these differences in executive functioning and how that may impact the performance of certain tasks or understanding of certain social contexts, we're really going to think from this more kind of positive approach to how can we use what our individuals are really good at, that we can kind of build on that to create some ways that they can approach things that may be more difficult.
Absolutely. And, last week we talked about special interests, and that really speaks to the motivation, and ultimately those special interests can be fuel for lifelong learning and or employment. All right. Having a hard time advancing the slides for some reason. Okay.
And the last piece before we kind of dive into executive functioning is, again, kind of thinking about the long term in mind, right? So these are from the Virginia Department of Education's Profile of a Graduate, and they've really identified what they call the 5 C's. And these are the 5 main kind of core areas where we really want our graduates, all of our graduates, regardless whether they have a disability or not, to have these kind of skills and experiences that are really going to set them on a positive course to be successful in adulthood. And those are really critical thinking skills, but also creative thinking skills, collaboration with others, communication, and citizenship within their different kind of layers of those communities. And so as we talk about executive functioning, Staci and I are going to be kind of highlighting a few of how some of these strategies can build into those areas. So let's talk about executive functioning itself. You may be familiar with some of the concepts. I'll kind of explain how I think about executive functioning. And that, I like the metaphor of like an air traffic controller. So an executive functioning refers to sort of a set of cognitive processes that kind of coordinate and organize and prioritize each of those individual cognitive tasks that the brain does, right? So executive functioning is kind of like an air traffic controller. It's not flying the plane, it's not restocking the plane or maintaining it, but it's coordinating all those activities to make sure the airport functions smoothly and the planes can get in and out as quickly as possible without kind of creating a log jam or a safety risk, or making sure that mistakes happen. So the executive functioning kind of looks down and reflects on all of the operation that's happening kind of below the observation tower and make sure that all that's going smoothly. And executive functioning operates in the same way. So we're going to talk about a lot of different ways that executive functioning works, but really all of them have a similar idea in common, is that they kind of coordinate and organize, right?
I love that analogy, and I love how you explain it too, Josh. Thank you so much for doing that. You know, those pieces of the brain that control executive functioning are all in the frontal lobe. And the last part of the brain to develop is the frontal lobe. So not only do we see deficits in executive functioning in people with different abilities or who are neurodiverse, but even young teenagers struggle with this. So you may have a son or daughter who's a middle schooler, and you're thinking, oh geez, these are some problems for them too. Well, that's possible because executive functioning really doesn't completely develop until about 25. So it's kind of bad news. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few areas that really, when we think about executive functioning, those tasks that are part of that. So planning, that's the idea of goal setting. And goal setting can be pretty challenging because it's kind of an abstract concept. There's something that you want or you need to achieve, but what do you have to do to meet that goal? And how do you plan to address that goal? Well, that goes to organizing. You have to identify what those steps are. And those can be things like, I have a goal that I have this paper due in a month and a half. And there are these 8 steps that I have to meet along the way in order to meet that goal. Am I going to get all those steps done at midnight the night before it's due? Probably not. Or if you do, not very well. Well, okay, well, that goes to time awareness and time management and setting priorities and understanding, okay, kind of backwards working from that main goal and figuring out what are those aspects that need to be in place, how long is it going to take, and how am I going to meet that goal and be there and do it on time, whether it's a task, whether it's getting to work, whether it's brushing your teeth, getting dressed, getting out the door, kind of backwards chaining, saying, okay, it takes me 5 minutes to get dressed in the morning. I better plan for 10, just so that I'm ahead of the game. Because you know that sometimes things get in our way and we don't often meet those time commitments. The working memory piece is pretty interesting. So that's holding that whole plan in place and all the steps while working on those steps. So you have to think, okay, here's the end goal. I need to get to work on time. Well, here are the 18 steps I have to do in order to do that. And those are things like all the morning routine ideas. It's making your lunch. It's having a breakfast. It's making sure that you've locked the door. You've told your parents where you're going. All these things, but still being able to get to work on time. And so that holding all those pieces in place can be challenging. And oftentimes we forget things. It's like going to the grocery store without a list. You know, okay, I'm going to make tacos tonight and here are all the ingredients I need. And then you get home and you say, you know what? I don't have the taco shells and I forgot the cheese. That's because it wasn't all in your working memory. And so we need to really think about some tools on how to address that. And we're going to talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, you know, the flip side of that is, you know, a lot of our guys with autism are really good at like those focus tasks that don't require some of these things. So being able to focus on one task for a long period of time that doesn't require shifting between things can be really good. And we also see these come across in a lot of academic skills. So we think about, you know, a lot of folks with autism kind of struggle with reading comprehension, but are great decoders, right? So decoding is a kind of individual process that has specific concrete rules Whereas comprehension requires more of this working memory, right? You have to hold ideas about characters and setting and place or the context of certain writing in mind while you're sort of cycling that new information that you're reading and decoding kind of through those different processes. So we see it come across in math with multi-step problems and in reading with that comprehension piece as well. So these, you know, have kind of big abstract concepts, but they also filter into those academic and social situations too.
Thanks for that, Josh.
Yeah.
You want to start this page?
Sure, yeah. So self-regulation is another big piece, right? And we think about self-regulation being sort of the ability to, well, first self-reflect, right? And so in order to self-reflect, we have to sort of have this idea of a theory of mind that we call it sometimes. And that's sort of this ability to step back from ourselves, sort of in this metacognitive way, to where we can reflect on our own behaviors and actions and context and things like that. But that requires executive functioning, right? So you have to be able to sort of do two things at once by kind of self-reflecting. And then self-regulation requires another piece that gets into more of the response inhibition, regulation affect, and initiation, which is then to go one step further and not only to self-reflect and understand, okay, I'm maybe emotionally dysregulated and I'm feeling kind of cruddy today, and I need to do something to get myself in a better state, or maybe I'm struggling with a task and I need to sort of come up with another plan to address it in a different way and problem solve like that. Or maybe like I'm kind of putting off doing something I don't want to do. I need to sort of organize what I need to do to plan and start it, and then initiation piece. So as we think about it, that executive functioning really plays a key role in a lot of these abilities to self-reflect and then to choose strategies and kind of problem solve when things come up, right? And, you know, we see this all happen all the time in real life, right, Stace?
Absolutely. And you think about in our own lives, we have to self-regulate all the time when we're driving, when we're at work, when we're at school. And we've learned through trial and error, through from being reprimanded perhaps, what to do to self-regulate. And it may be that we can get up and take a walk, or we take a minute and jot down everything that we need to do for the day. And that's our way of self-regulating. Well, we need to help other folks learn what's good for them and what will help them be able to do the same thing. Ooh, flexibility. This is not just the ability to touch your toes, but it's the ability to shift attention. So we have to do this all the time. And I think about students in middle and high school where they have classes that you're in one class, the bell rings and you have to go and shift your attention, stop that task and move to another task and move to another class. And it may be a whole different area of the brain that's working. So you might be in an art class and now you have to go to algebra. Well, that's really shifting your attention, shifting focus, and really understanding how to switch how you're going to go about things so that you aren't stuck in this rigid, no, I have to finish my art project before I do anything else. And another piece of this is problem solving. And Josh knows this, that I preach about problem solving. We never want our kids to fail. We really don't. However, when they get to be adults and if they can't problem solve, they're inevitably going to fail. And the best thing that we can do now is set up opportunities for them to have some problems, help them through the problems. And if they choose the wrong answer or if they fail, if they fail in a small scale, like didn't turn something in on time or didn't go to work, was late for work, we can help them problem solve that and say, okay, see, here are the issues. And this is the thing that you need to realize, that how that action related to this consequence. And we really need to think about how to teach those ideas and solutions so that things are much more smooth. You know, being late for work once is okay, maybe, but being late for work repeatedly gets you fired. So we really want to make sure that students and kids are learning how to problem solve from a very early age. And you can do all sorts of things from early childhood through adulthood to address this.
Yeah, and we're gonna definitely get into some kind of approaches and strategies that we can, provide supports that can give us structure to address some of these issues with executive functioning. As we think about sort of the air traffic controller idea, and you don't have that ability to coordinate, so you're kind of stuck doing one thing at a time. It's hard to think of a plan A and plan B because that's kind of two different things, and then to evaluate those is another step to that. I really feel like flexibility for a lot of guys with autism is really kind of a double whammy, because not only is there that flexibility of sort of weighing both and that sort of evaluation, but before we even get to that, executive functioning really impacts the ability to predict what's going to happen next. And so we see that hit our guys a lot with that anxiety about new experiences and new routines. And we also know that our guys don't generalize well from previous experiences. So going to a new space that folks haven't been to before is extremely anxiety provoking because it takes a lot of working memory and executive functioning to kind of go through whatever's happening in that environment. And then also to take in that contextual information to say, oh, hey, I've been to other classrooms like this, even though I'm in 4th grade now instead of 3rd grade, there are similar things that I can sort of draw from my experience to use in kind of critical ways. That requires a lot of executive functioning. It's a little bit difficult for our guys. So that prediction of understanding what's expected and understanding what's going to happen in certain situations, that breakdown really ratchets up the anxiety even before we get to like, okay, now I need to be flexible in this situation. So it really hits our guys in kind of two different places. So it's really a key area that as we think about areas that executive functioning impacts and how we want to put some strategies in place, flexibility is a really key one, right?
Absolutely. And I think about COVID-19 and how, when students are going to be re-entering schools, the flexibility that is going to be needed. And we really need to start planning now.
Absolutely. And then, with the changes kind of week to week and month to month, even those expectations may shift as well. So we're definitely having some very intuitive, concrete approaches, and we'll get to how we can look at some of those.
All right, persistence. This is the kind of get her done, the ability to keep going, even though you don't want to do it. It's, you may have these special interests and they're really much more exciting, or, getting back onto Minecraft instead of doing this task is kind of preoccupying your mind, but it's the persistence and drive to follow through and get a task done, task completion. Those distractions, we have them all the time. I have them constantly, but it's the ability to say, okay, I can think about that after I get X, Y, and Z done. Or thinking about, how about video games? If I do X, Y, and Z, then I can spend some time doing Candy Crush or whatever. So it's that persistence and being able to get done. And, as we speak about this from an adult perspective, that's the stuff that's going to keep you employed. That and the social piece. But okay, I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
You want to?
No, just the other piece of persistence, I think, goes back to that idea of having trouble predicting, and that sense of sometimes we have to really make time more concrete for a lot of our guys. And that means sort of visual timers sometimes, or sort of using first ends, or ways to show that if I'm doing something that I don't necessarily want to do, there's a kind of concrete and finite amount of time that needs to be, that we need to persist within that. And then after that, it's going to be over.
That's a very good point. It doesn't have to be to completion, but it could be to a time frame. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So when we think about all this executive functioning things, we have these questions that run through our minds. So why are all these problems occurring? Why is my son or daughter not being able to get these tasks done? Or why do they come downstairs and say, why am I here? And, you give them 3 tasks to do, which you think is pretty reasonable, and they do 2. And you're like, well, what happened to the 3rd one? So why is that happening? And of course, relates back to executive functioning, but what piece of that? So when is this problem occurring? Is it when they're doing something that's more preferred? Is it when they're tired? Is it at specific times of the day? So what are the skills that we need to address to make sure that this happens, that whatever the task is occurring, or whatever the problem is, the skills are there to make sure that it's done. You know, you could think about it as a performance error, or it's kind of can't versus won't, right, Josh?
Yeah.
So I can't do this because I don't know the steps needed to do this specific task, or I won't do it because I'm not motivated. I'd much rather do what I'm working on. I just don't want to. And those are all reasonable answers for that.
But I think, you know, yeah, absolutely. I think the can't versus won't, to me, is a really useful way to think about it, in terms of, you know, a lot of times these executive functioning issues are really kind of like lurk beneath the surface and are not immediately apparent, and can, so a can't, or like you know, not being able to kind of process or do that kind of shifting that we've talked about in these previous things, can a lot of times look like a won't. And it may look like I just don't want to do this, or I'm not going to do this, or you tell me something, I'm going to do the opposite. And that is teachers and as parents can be extremely frustrating, right? Right, Stace?
Uh-huh. You know, I'm going to use my son as an example, and I swear I wasn't going to do this, but when I do this talk with Josh all the time, he always comes up. So just today, there were 3 things to do: take out the recycling, check the mail, unload the dishwasher.
Or Peter.
And so he's like, I don't know if the recycling needs to go out. I'm like, well, you can look. And it did. He takes it out.
Does he get points for choice making anyway?
No. And so he checked the mail, and he then went back up to his room. I texted him, you forgot the dishwasher. So he said, ooh, sorry, comes back down, stands in the kitchen, and didn't know what he's like, oh, right, the dishwasher. So part of the issue is he's motivated by the video game that he's playing, and I'm interrupting a preferred activity. But he also doesn't really like the task because he's not sure where everything goes. So I need to be more mindful and maybe do the task with him to show him where things need to be. See, wasn't that much better than throwing him completely under the bus?
Yeah, I'll try not to throw Stacy you under the bus too much, Stacy, but sometimes when we do this presentation, Peter he just won't do it at all. So that's great. It's good improvement, Stacy. I want to reinforce you. I appreciate that you gave him both can'ts and won'ts this time. But it can definitely, you know, as a teacher as well, there are definitely moments when working with students where it feels like it's just a won't, but then kind of we need to sort of step back and check ourselves and really self-reflect and self-regulate and think like, okay, hold on, what may be going on under the surface? This is not just a personal attack against me as either a parent or an educator. Yeah, thanks.
And then thinking about those accommodations and modifications. So the accommodations might be, well, he's not unloading the dishwasher independently himself. So I know that he can do the silverware and he can do the plates. The Tupperware, he does not want to do. So I'll do that and he does the rest. And so we're building up tolerance and skill. So if my strategies aren't working and I still believe that there's some sort of issue here, then I need to go back to the drawing board of what do I need to do instead to make sure that these things do work. And it's really about having the student or child own that strategy. So here are some interventions. We can look at a variety of levels, environmental level. So what in the classroom can you do? Can you put some cues in place that would be helpful and like a visual representation of what needs to do, what needs to happen? You know, in elementary school, they have hooks and cubbies and names, and those are all environmental cues. But as kids get older, that stuff goes away, and oftentimes we still need that. So thinking about what we can do in the environment to make sure that happens. It might be that there's a bin for shoes right out inside the door to your house. Well, that's where the shoes go instead of just randomly thrown wherever. That doesn't happen in my house often, Josh. I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. How about you talk about student?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think at each of these levels, maybe just let me back up and say, I think we kind of use similar approaches, and those are really grounded in thinking about, what are the supports we need to put in place to fill that gap that's not happening kind of cognitively for the student, right? And so as we think about that working memory and putting pieces together and creating context, lots of times it's sort of making those connections between ideas or tasks that may be the kind of breakdown point, right? So we tend to use a lot of visual supports, as Staci touched on. So that could be sort of something environmental like a cubby or a place marker, or what we use in what we call the teach method, where we have very concrete kind of processes and routines for completing tasks in a certain order, and students can learn sort of that structure and routine. But that also happens at the student level, and that can look a little bit different. And we use the sort of student level interventions a lot for that self-management. So that may be teaching students to use kind of time management strategies. I love technology for this. Teaching students to use like a calendar and really breaking down point by point. So, a lot of us have trouble with I know I have trouble with like kind of getting out the door in a timely fashion, right? So if I've got to leave to go somewhere at 1 and I have to sort of like get ready and brush my teeth and get dressed, and I may allot myself 5 minutes without thinking, oh, well, each of those tasks themselves takes 5 minutes. So I need to actually start getting ready 15, 20 minutes before instead of 5 minutes before. But by setting those up and using a calendar or another structure that will maybe prompt me with an alert on my phone or device, or to just kind of check that routinely, then I can kind of address that ahead of time. And so we do the same for students. We can create strategies with individual schedules, or with using technology to supplement that.
I really like that idea of technology, Josh. And I know that with all of our Zoom meetings that we've had for work, if they're in my calendar and I get a reminder 10 minutes before, then I can kind of stop what I'm doing and shift my focus. It's a prompt for me to shift my focus onto the next thing, next meeting, next task, next whatever. So Google Calendar is fantastic.
You want to talk about motivation a little bit and reinforcement?
Sure. Reinforcement obviously is most important. None of us will do something without reinforcement. We love to know that we've done something well. And whether that's a good job, or it's knowing that the task has been completed, turned in on time, and it's no longer looming over my head. Those things are super important. What's important to consider, though, is what is it? What is the preference? What is the motivator for your son, daughter, or student? The motivation for me is going to look different from the motivation for Josh, or the motivation for my son or daughter or whoever. So we need to be pretty thoughtful about what those motivation strategies will look like. And you can learn that by just observing your son or daughter, or your student. What do they talk about? What do they gravitate towards? What do they like to do? For my son, it's anything electronic, watching videos of people playing videos. It's chopping wood, perhaps. For my daughter, it's the ability to go to Wawa and get a sub. So whatever is motivating, that's what we need to use as our reinforcement for folks. And this goes across settings: home, school, community, what have you. So if there's someone working in the community and they get a break if they're able to do a certain amount of task, then what is that break going to look like? It might be that they go next door and get a candy bar, or they are able to take a walk around the building, or they can spend a few minutes on their phone texting someone or looking at a video, and then set the timer in order to go back to work. So really looking at what those strategies are and making them meaningful to the individual.
Yeah, and I would just add to that and say, like, really, that last piece is so critical. And to get to that last piece that we talked about at the beginning of that independence,
self-monitoring,
beyond school and adulthood, getting outside the home, getting outside the school, and getting in the community and practicing these skills and using these strategies is critical to that success. So take it on the road for sure. All right, let's get into some specific strategies.
This is important. The child has to own the skill to use it independently. And, you know, I make this mistake often. And the things that I love, you know, Post-it notes, to-do lists, I got it all. But if I try to force that onto someone who doesn't want to do it that way, that is an absolute nightmare, and it's not going to work. And then I'm going to be frustrated as a teacher or as a parent. You know, Josh, you told me about one of the students that you worked with who had kind of the one bin where he put everything.
It's called the dump.
The dump. I was going to say the garbage, but I knew that wasn't right.
Yeah, close.
Why don't you talk about that real quick?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so as Staci said, I think the student has to own it. The child has to own it. And so I think, you know, we really have to provide some different options for what works. And that goes with self-regulation, with organization, with any of it, but especially with organizing stuff. So for example, you know, with this one kiddo I work with, you know, he had trouble keeping track of his assignments, lost his homework, could never find papers. Everything was sort of in that crumpled heap at that sort of like bottom of the backpack kind of thing, where there's just like all the crud. That's where all the papers were, and then it just was repeatedly matched by all the notebooks. And so that wasn't really working for him. But you know, when he'd worked with teachers before, they tried to do things like color coding, and there's a different folder for each one. None of that worked for him. It was just too much for him to process in that environment where he was trying to get in and out of class and deal with the sensory stuff, and it was just all way too much. So we eventually found a system called the dump. And the dump was just all the papers went in one folder, but in a way that wasn't at a crumpled heap at the bottom of the backpack. But then there was a time that we would sort through the trash in the dump. And so everything in the dump would come out at really structured times to then sort them into those separate folders or files or whatever needed to happen. And sort of in that more structured time, apart from all the other distractions that were going on, do that more focused planning and organizing part. And that really worked for him, and it was a game changer.
Yeah, I love when you tell that story, because I think about all the color coding that I've tried to do with people and realize, nah, maybe not so useful. Yeah. Okay, go for it.
All right, so lots of different ways that we can modify the environment. But really kind of thinking back, a lot of these are about providing that structure and providing that those links between those separate pieces and tasks that may be missing. And so as we think about those in the environment, we can change the setting, we can change the kind of physical environment and structure, we can modify the task. And so we can kind of make things shorter, we can make them chunked or separate them into pieces. And that's really helpful, especially with things that are more complex than I think we give them credit for. Writing is a big example. We think about writing as just, you sit down and you write, it's one task, right? But the writing process involves a lot of self-reflection about the prompt itself, organizing thoughts, structuring those thoughts in an outline, expanding those using different type of language, reflecting them back on that. There's lots of different steps of that writing process. So as we can pull those out and chunk them, that process becomes more easy to tackle and more intuitive. And then we can also provide prompting. And so we can do that sort of more directly as a parent or teacher through verbal prompts or physical or gestural prompts. But we can also use visual prompts, and we can use prompts that are utilized through technology or other ways to help students to learn to self-monitor a little bit more. Okay, I'm gonna take this one.
Sure, so some student interventions. Those executive skills that we addressed earlier, we need to kind of piece them out one at a time and think about exactly how we're going to address each of those. And maybe some of your sons and daughters don't have problems with all areas of executive functioning, but we need to figure out where those splinter skills are and teach kind of discreetly those skills to shore up those areas. And please remember that frontal lobe development doesn't really completely occur until adulthood. So it's going to be sketchy, but we can still certainly provide supports as needed. And we've said this a million times, but the student must buy into that skill. And it has to be second nature, so that you know, they use the to-do list, they use the dump, they use highlighting, they use webs for organizing thoughts, whatever it is. They become second nature, and it's like, oh, here's a math assignment. I know that I need to get my graph paper out. Or here's someone told me what the assignment is for today. I have to write it down in my planner or in my Google Calendar. So it becomes second nature, so that that prompting doesn't happen. Now, that's not to say that we don't need prompts to begin with, but we definitely need to fade them so the student becomes more independent and more self-sufficient and self-monitoring. And of course, as we've said, reinforcement to motivate. If someone gets their work done on time, whether it's unloading the dishwasher or it's turning in an assignment, reinforcement is important to say, hey, oh my gosh, you did that and I didn't have to tell you 47 times? Fantastic. That's amazing. I appreciate that. That reinforcement goes a very long way. This is a visual representation of the prompting hierarchy that we talk about all the time. And you know, full physical prompting, which I try never to do because it is pretty intrusive. And so if I were to full physically prompt someone to do a task, that task might become even more more aversive. So I try to use more partial physical prompt, maybe modeling, visual modeling, video modeling, whatever. But visual prompts are by far the best and the least intrusive. Visual prompts happen at the office, at school, in the community. We know how to get from place A to place B by visual prompts. If you go anywhere, there are visual prompts to get us from those different points. So really thinking about what visual prompts will be most successful. And you can certainly pair those with verbal or gestural modeling, what have you, but you want to fade to the visual prompt.
Yeah, so here are a few examples of sort of different ways that we can kind of structure students' ability to sort of self-regulate and self-monitor. So the first is a behavior contract, and that's really going to be sort of provide a structure for us to sort of look at a set of behaviors that may be interfering, or ideally are targeting what we want to see our children perform, and kind of what are the supports and contexts that need to happen in. And that's going to create an opportunity to kind of look more objectively alongside the children and students we're working with, to be able to kind of work on and increase, ideally, those positive behaviors. The key here is you want to make sure that these are really kind of specific, almost like a real contract, and sort of airtight, so to speak, that they don't introduce loopholes where, you know, the student can kind of continue engaging in the interfering behavior while still meeting sort of the letter of the law, so to speak. So we do want to be really concrete and specific with the expectations in these. But this should be set the stage for a collaborative relationship where we're working with the child or student to get to a better outcome, rather than, hey, you didn't do this and we're going to get in a power struggle over it. That's not the behavior contract. And then the second two images are really different ways that we can structure sort of that self-regulation, that emotional piece. That's really a key. We haven't talked about it as much, but emotions are really a key area that executive functioning can impact. That ability to reflect and then articulate how we're feeling and what that means in terms of how we need to regulate our behavior is really critical. So a lot of times we provide sort of very structured sort of levels and strategies that are connected with feeling at each of those levels. So these,
you know, those emotional regulation tools also have to be very individualized, and there needs to be buy-in for that. You know, I think about when I first started in the field, I worked on deep breathing and teaching kids to take deep breaths. And then one time this student said, "I'm not gonna breathe anymore. I'm not gonna count to 10. Oh, got it. Like, and that, my telling him to relax and take a deep breath amped him up. So finding those tools that are important and meaningful to them as well. And with the behavior contract, really outlining what those expectations are. So, and if you think about this for home, you know, I think if you tell someone to make a bed, what I know making a bed looks like versus what a 5-year-old versus a teenager, what their bed making looks like is different. So what are those expectations? Sheets are laid down, pillows on top, no clothes on the bed. And then it's almost like a checklist. And so you know what the expectations are, your son or daughter or a student know what the expectations are, and they're meeting. So then when you go back to check, hey, did you make your bed? You can go through the expectations and say, you know what, you did 2 out of 3, let's help with the pillows. And really kind of shape what those outcomes are.
All right, so we're getting a little short on time, Staci. What do you think if we kind of zoom through this, and then you know, we'd love to set aside a little bit of time, even if we run over a little bit, for some questions from you all. So kind of as we're talking, as things come up in that chat box, feel free to throw some questions out there, and we're going to kind of, like I said, we'll try to zoom through these specific strategies because there's so many different ways that we can sort of address and tackle this. But we'd also love to hit on some of your specific questions too. So go ahead and drop those in the chat box as we're talking, and we'll try to zoom through to at least get through the content by one.
Yeah, I believe our buddy Zach will help us with the questions. So
awesome.
Okay, right. Working memory. You want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the working memory is really that part of sort of shifting between those things. So, you know, as we talked about before, the strategies that we're going to put in there are really those that are going to provide an intuitive structure that's going to make up for the kind of difficulty with shifting between those things. And so things like agenda books, outlines, visual prompts, to-do list, I'd add to this and say in classrooms with academics, graphic organizers are really key, to where we can say this information goes here, this information goes here. These are the 3 things that need to go in here. So we can kind of pull out that organization piece and that working memory piece from this. But that said, just like the example of the dump, agenda books are not all created equally, right? I mean, I'm sure that many of you have had agenda books come home, and at the end of the year, you're looking at it and there's 3 things written in it all year, right? So finding a system and finding a structure, and sometimes that agenda book and these working memory concrete strategies also need to work with a routine and a structure throughout that maybe provides a specific time, or maybe that's 5 minutes before the bell rings at the end of class, that's the time to pull the assignment off the board and write it down. Maybe there's a specific prompt that a teacher can provide to be able to do that behavior and use that strategy. Can you go to the next one and take the next one, Stace?
Yep. Come on. Okay. This is one of my favorite, self-monitoring, self-help. So we all have these moments where there are tons of things going on and you're working really hard, and then there's that moment when, oh gee, there's a squirrel, and you lose complete focus. A lot of things that you can do to address this include preferential seating. That might be in the front of the classroom, but it also might be in the far left corner away from windows, or whatever is most beneficial for the student. You can have things where you have like a meeting time with your student and say, okay, what do you think works for you? I notice that you like to look out the window. What can we do to address that? There could be a timer so that they need to stay on focus for a while. I had one student who had a timer that had a buzzer. And so when the buzzer went off, he gave himself a check if he had sustained focus and was working on his work. Breaking down those tasks, making sure that it's almost like a task completion, right? Kind of doing X, Y, and Z. And when you get to the end, then you have your ability to say, I've completed that task. Having a secret cue is one of my favorite things. And this is, I've had teachers who would do a certain hand movement or hold up a certain flag or what have you. That was a cue for the students in her class, all students, to orient to her or to make sure that they're focusing on their activity. And I think those are really quite helpful. Movement breaks. We have movement breaks. We've been sitting in our chair right now for almost an hour. I want to get up and move, and I will when this is done. And we do that so that we can kind of regain our focus, so we can get back to work and have that there. Having water, that's a great thing. It's refreshing. It helps you stay kind of hydrated and focused and get your brain moving. But also using student interest. That's oftentimes the most motivating. And if you can work that into activities, assignments, tasks at home or at work, fantastic. Maybe your son or daughter really likes to listen to music. Well, they can certainly do chores around the house with earbuds in, listening to the music that they want. And that can help them focus and stay engaged as well.
Okay, so initiation can feel like a tricky one, but there's really some really concrete ways that we can approach it. I think creating those predictable routines are really key. And this can link up with what Staci just talked about with using those preferences, right? And so sometimes like writing may not be a favorite thing of mine. It can feel really daunting when I'm approaching kind of a new kind of big paper. But if I have a consistent place where I go and, you know, the computer I like to work with, or the nice pen that I'm really motivated to write with. And for me, it's creating a routine that really kind of breaks down and chunks those things. I'm not kind of writing down and looking at the blank page. I'm going to start with kind of pulling the resources that I need, and then just bullet pointing and just doing that next point, that really easy task. I'm just going to throw an idea on the page. I'm not going to worry about what it says. And then I'm going to shift later at that later stage to really writing those out and trying to take, you know, more difficult things on with kind of fitting those pieces together. Pairing with other students can really help, so that there's some sort of accountability and there's the social motivation there. And kind of related to that task chunking, kind of goal setting. And so how can we really create benchmarks that can break down and show children and students, kind of show them their progress towards a goal, so that you get some reinforcement. And so these bigger projects and assignments don't feel so overwhelming and daunting at first. So as we said, timelines and checklists. Choice is also a big one. You know, if we have, you know, 5 things that need to happen, some degree of choice about which one happens first or in which order can be helpful, where we can work in choice.
Or what pen you want to use.
Yeah, totally.
Planning and organizing, we've already talked about this quite a bit, but this goes with all the other things. Breaking down those tasks that seem very daunting and huge to smaller tasks with clear, explicit directions and expectations. Rubrics are amazing. When I was going through school, there were not rubrics. So I'd get a grade back and be like, well, I think I did it, and why didn't I get an A? Well, rubrics now can show exactly what is required to get the desired results. And if you could, the more that teachers can do that, the better.
The more specific they can be, the
yes.
rubrics are, the more helpful they are.
Yes, yes. Again, here are my, of course, favorite things: color coding and calendars and agendas. But again, it has to be buy-in by the student. And there's tons of virtual tools too, with long-term planning, goal setting, whatever is most beneficial. And it might be a trial and error, and you could sit down with your son or daughter or student and work through them and figure out what works best. And the sooner and the younger that you can do that, the better, because as you go through school, things get harder and you have to be more and more independent. And then when you get into adulthood, well, you're an adult, so you're much more independent.
Time management is a big one. Hopefully you've gotten a sense, as we've talked about executive functioning this last hour, that it really impacts this ability to sort of make useful progress through these more abstract things. And time is extremely abstract, right? And so as much as we can provide some structure or kind of break down time, the better. And so that looks like, you know, visual and different kinds of scheduling, having routines along with sort of visual checklists to have those time parameters built into them and kind of break those down. And then, you know, with pretty much everything we've talked about, using reinforcement with this to kind of encourage and motivate children and students to adopt these and use them at first is really key.
Ironically, we have not been good with this today.
No, we haven't. We had a lot, you added a lot of content though, friend.
I know. It's important. It's important
to me.
It is
good stuff. We could talk for hours about this.
I know. Modifications, making sure things are engaging. You know, I think about math assignments, and a lot of our students can do a math problem, but then they have to do 20 more. And by the fifth one, they've lost engagement. So kind of figuring out how to make it more meaningful and more engaging. It might be that you do 3, you show me your work, and you get them right. Good work, you are done. Or group work is another thing. And that's something that is very challenging for our sons and daughters and students, but it's something that we need to work on because in jobs, you have to work as a team. Flexibility, go.
Really critical one. So that first bullet point, I would put with a little caveat that I think we do want to, oh, my friend Joyce Kelly, I haven't seen you in ages. We do want to reduce those unexpected changes, but I would put the asterisk there temporarily. And so we want to modify those unexpected changes, but down the road, we want to teach students problem-solving approaches and skills that are going to allow them to become more flexible. And this is really, I'm sure that pretty much everybody in this Zoom room can attest. This is a really key area that can really be a huge barrier to participation and inclusion and interaction for a lot of our guys in a lot of different situations. So we do want to, reduce maybe some of those bigger unexpected changes to prevent some of the behavior at first. We want to provide some warning, some pre-teaching, but we also want to do some of those other things. We want to provide practice opportunities. We want to give some language to those unexpected things so that we can start to teach some problem solving and some approaches to teach our children and our students to learn what to do when something unexpected happens and to get used to unexpected things because life is unexpected. And so giving language, even for younger kids with, so having that structure of, and that predictable kind of routine with a visual schedule, but starting to introduce, if we're going to do, have breakfast and then get dressed, or, brush your teeth and then, do some chores and then do some homework. And maybe we're going to introduce something wacky or something unexpected. And at first that's going to be a really cool, fun, reinforcing surprise. And then over time, something wacky may be something neutral, and something wacky may be, having to do something else or to switch things around. So introducing that flexibility early on and giving some language to it, and sort of teaching and reinforcing and giving opportunities to shift to a plan B or to shift to an alternate approach is really, really critical.
We talked about this also, the problem solving, and Josh just spoke about this. We have to figure out what the goal is and what the plan is to get there and how to evaluate your progress along the way. And these are big, big skills that as adults we've grown to learn, but we need to step back and start teaching this at a younger age for all students, not just students with different abilities. So really putting those modifications and supports along the way to make it as useful as possible and as beneficial to adulthood.
And there's so much to cover. I mean, it really, I really feel like this executive functioning piece really is a key way of understanding a lot of the issues that a lot of our folks run into in school environments and community and communication. But this social emotional piece is really critical, and we could spend a whole other hour just talking about the social emotional implications of executive functioning. But it really leads to a lot of our students getting stuck and not sure how to problem solve. But then also, we haven't even talked about it, but even things like conversation skills and the back and forth of social interaction. If you're not able to sort of reflect on what somebody else is thinking and feeling and reading their social cues, that can really be a breakdown. And so teaching students strategies that they can, compensate for that lack of being able to sort of do it on the fly, and learning certain tricks of what to read in certain situations, or what clues to look for to shift between different conversations can really be critical. And then a lot of the problem solving approaches that we talked about really kind of carry over into here. As we think about navigating, social disagreements and making compromises, and a lot of those social skills can be critical.
This is just a brief replacement behaviors. We think about, you'll see a lot of behaviors occur because of lack of executive functioning skills. So we need to put in replacement behaviors. So those are things like asking for help, raising your hand, saying, I don't know. And those skills are often really late to develop. And a lot of our sons and daughters are perfectionists, and they don't want to ask for help because they feel like if I ask for help, then I'm less, or I can do it on my own. But really teaching those skills and making it completely okay for them to do so is important. Even if it's very simple of, I need help unloading the dishwasher. Instead of not doing it at all, if my son asks, can I have help? Or I don't know where something goes, that would be far better. And that goes for all environments.
I think really the key for this one is when we think about a replacement behavior, and building on what Staci just mentioned, we want to make sure whatever that replacement behavior is accomplishing the same thing as that interfering behavior is. And so we want to match up and really think about, why is the child engaging in this inappropriate behavior, and what would a better way to accomplish that same thing be, whether that's getting attention, maybe allowing for a temporary escape from a certain activity that's not their favorite. And so thinking about sort of matching those up is really critical.
Good point. All right, these are just a few visuals of different coping skills. All right, we have some questions, but I'm going to throw up our poll that we do every week. So if you guys can engage in that. And then Zach, if you can help us with questions, that would be great. We're at 1 o'clock. If you guys can stay, that'd be wonderful. And I'm sorry we're running a little bit over.
Okay, what you got, Stace?
Okay. Have you seen presentations by Sarah Ward using her 360 thinking?
So, I have not. Have you?
I have not. Apparently, she uses pictures for what is done. So we'll have to take a look into
Sure.
what Sarah Ward is doing.
Yeah,
Sounds
there's
great.
a lot of
Great
different
work out there.
approaches that take this this executive functioning, I think, lens or perspective is becoming a really kind of widely used way of thinking about it. I think it does a lot of the heavy lifting and thinking about what strategies and approaches are going to help set up kiddos for success. So we'll check it out.
Yeah. So like your son, my 17-year-old son is only motivated by electronics. How do you work with that when there's only so much to earn or take away? Well, I take it away, and they can earn it. There's been several times where my son has lost his phone completely. He's lost internet to his laptop, and he had to get work turned in on time. He had to speak respectfully to us at home. He had to do his very few chores in order to earn it back. And boy, was that awful. But that was most meaningful to him and most motivating and most impactful. If I were to have just said, you lose your phone for a day, he would be upset, but then he'd get it back. So it had to be pretty jarring in order to make an impact. It really stinks, by the way.
And I'll take a sort of a different tack on this one, and sort of it takes a little longer, this approach, but thinking about the long game. And I think the sooner we can sort of teach our students or our children the context and the rationale for why some of those expectations are really important is going to naturally increase their motivation. And so, Staci and I both come from this transition lens, as we talked about, thinking about those long-term outcomes. But the sooner that you can get your kids thinking about, okay, what are my long-term goals and my vision for the future that I want? And how do these things that mom and dad and my teachers are asking me to do going to lead to that? is really critical. And I'll share an example of a student that I had that was extremely smart, but like got straight C's, and he knew exactly how you know, what his scores would be on the tests, what his how much effort he needed to put into homework. He didn't like group work, so he didn't want to do group work. And so he knew exactly what he needed to do to maintain that C average and just fly under the radar, right? And so, you know, it was a real challenge to get him to think about, you know, why does he need to engage? And he can still pass without doing sort of group work and increasing and working on his social skills. But there was a disconnect between, you know, doing these things that are difficult and more aversive. So eventually we found, or I found a employee manual from a video game company. And this guy really wanted to be a video game designer and programmer. And so we found an employee handbook that outlined the expectations for programmers and employees that work for this really cool video game company. And they were, you got to work with others. You got to be a collaborative partner. You got to not be a jerk in the office. And reading that and seeing that in this context and seeing that connection between where he knew he wanted to be 10 years down the road and what he had to do sort of right now, even though it's kind of oogie, was really a game changer. And so sometimes if we can sort of build a motivation that may be more of a long-term play, down the road can be helpful.
That's a very great positive approach, Josh. I really appreciate that. Do you get resistance to picking strategies? I see this with my son. He keeps wanting to do the same things the same way, even if it doesn't work for him. Sounds like you have something, Josh.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, thinking about, like we talked about with the behavior contract, if we can create a structure, and there are a lot of different approaches that we work with. Social autopsy is one of them. And really, these are all kind of graphic organizers that show, you know, what's the situation in one field. So maybe write that out, right? You know, what's the approach that's being taken? And then what are the outcomes of that? And doing that together, and I really like using approaches that allow you to create a visual with your kid that allow you to sort of be beside them. And so it's not this interaction anymore. It's that let's look at this and then let's look together. Is this working for you? Like you do it, this is the approach that's being taken. What are the results of that? Are you happy with that? And what are some alternatives and what might those lead to? And so if we can kind of structure that thinking process and structure sort of making those links together, we can kind of work, I think, with our kids to come to those same results that we want them to just jump to, right?
Yep. Someone asked what graphic organizers are, so I'm going to share my screen.
Awesome.
Here is Google Images of graphic organizers. There are tons of them out there. If you go to Pinterest, if you Google image them, you can do graphic organizer by subject, but it's really taking information and building upon it. So this one here is like a web. You can put any word in here. It could be bugs. And what do you know about bugs? If the person has to write about bugs or photosynthesis or the history of whatever. So they're a way to use kind of a pictures and visual to chunk things in order to then bring it all together into something coherent. So sometimes it's hard to get from here to something written, but this is a very good start because sometimes pen to paper or fingers to keys is where the big gap is. And it's almost a fear of putting that information down or not knowing where to start. So these are really great tools to help that process.
Two things I love about these is, one, they allow you to really look at the relationship between different concepts and different information. And so you're step one, putting in one piece of information, step two, putting in other information. And then once you can see both those out there, really think about how are these two things related to each other. And so these getting into these more complex things that if you're trying to juggle these ideas in your head, get lost in it. And so they really get into this relationship. And that's really, as students move through school and especially get into, you know, once really we get beyond third grade, we're really starting to kind of try to piece information and make synthesis or make connections between ideas. And so that really gets at those higher level cognitive tasks. And the second thing I love about them is they're appropriate for all ages. You know,
Absolutely.
use them with college students. We can use them with kindergartners. We all need to, you know, learning is really all about sort of taking information and finding how these pieces fit together. So we can kind of scaffold them and use them throughout.